At exactly 6:37 p.m., my mother stood, raised her wine glass, and proudly announced, "Now this is what success looks like." The entire dining room erupted in applause. My older brother had just been promoted. An $80,000 a year management position. Mom called him the child who finally made the family proud. Nobody noticed my phone vibrating beside my dinner plate. A text from my attorney read, "Congratulations. Tech acquisition finalized. $80 million wired successfully." I quietly locked my phone, refilled my water glass, and let everyone keep celebrating the wrong success. My name is Olivia Bennett, and I'm 33 years old. At 6:37 p.m. on a Sunday, I was halfway through my mother's roast chicken when she stood from her chair and tapped her wine glass with a fork. The room immediately fell silent. My parents hosted Sunday dinner almost every week, and nearly everyone was there. My older brother, Ethan, his wife, my grandparents, 2 aunts, 3 uncles, a few cousins, the usual crowd. Mom smiled proudly as she looked around the dining room. "I've been waiting all week to share this." Everyone leaned forward. "Ethan just received the promotion we've all been praying for." Applause filled the room. My father stood and clapped first. My grandmother wiped away happy tears. Even my youngest cousin whistled. Mom wrapped her arm around Ethan's shoulders. "My son is officially a regional operations manager." More applause. $80,000 a year, Dad announced proudly. "Now that's what success looks like." Everyone raised their glasses, including me. Ethan smiled modestly, but I could tell he was enjoying every second. To be fair, he had worked hard. He deserved congratulations. What hurt wasn't that everyone celebrated him. It was that nobody had ever celebrated me. For as long as I could remember, Ethan had been the family's golden child. Straight A student, football captain, business degree, corporate promotions. Everything he accomplished became family history. Everything I accomplished somehow became a hobby. When I studied computer science, Mom called it a phase. When I skipped vacations to build software, Dad joked that I was still playing with computers. Whenever relatives asked what I did for work, someone usually answered before I could. "Olivia designs apps or websites or something." Nobody really knew. Nobody really asked. About 8 years earlier, I'd started a small software company with 2 college friends. We rented a tiny office above an old printing shop. 3 folding desks, second-hand computers, 1 coffee maker that broke every other week. Most months we barely earned enough to pay ourselves. Several times I wondered if everyone had been right about me. But every time I thought about quitting, something inside me refused. Slowly, 1 client became 5. 5 became 20. 20 became hundreds. Eventually, we developed an artificial intelligence logistics platform that began attracting attention from companies much larger than ours. I never talked about it at family dinners. Not because it was a secret, because experience had taught me nobody cared. If Ethan earned a certificate, dinner conversations lasted hours. If I signed a new corporate client, someone usually interrupted to ask whether I'd considered getting a real job. Eventually, I stopped bringing work up altogether. Back at the dinner table, Mom lifted her glass again. I always knew Ethan would make this family proud. The room erupted in applause once more. At that exact moment, my phone vibrated beside my plate. I glanced down. 1 unread message. Daniel Brooks, my attorney. The preview read only 5 words. "Congratulations. Acquisition officially closed." My heartbeat slowed. Not faster. Slower. I quietly unlocked my phone beneath the table. The full message appeared. "Congratulations. Tech acquisition finalized successfully. $80 million has been wired according to closing instructions. Call me whenever you're free." I stared at the screen for 2 long seconds. Then I locked my phone, set it face down beside my water glass, reached for another dinner roll, and smiled politely as everyone continued celebrating Ethan. Nobody noticed the message. Nobody asked why my phone had buzzed. Nobody realized that while they were applauding my brother's biggest career milestone, the largest financial transaction of my entire life had just happened. 3 inches away from my dinner plate. While everyone laughed around the dining table, my mind drifted back 8 years. Back to the day I told my parents I wasn't accepting the corporate job I'd been offered after college. Instead, I wanted to build software. Dad looked at me like I'd announced I was moving to the moon. "You're throwing away a perfectly good career." Mom sighed. "Ethan already has a stable job. One responsible child in the family is enough." I smiled and told them I'd be fine. The truth was, I wasn't sure I believed that myself. 3 weeks later, my best friends, Noah and Priya, and I rented a tiny office above an old printing shop downtown. Calling it an office was generous. The carpet smelled like dust. The air conditioner worked only when it felt like cooperating. Rain leaked through one corner of the ceiling every spring. Our desks came from a thrift store. Our chairs didn't even match. Some nights we stayed until 2 in the morning writing code because we couldn't afford to hire another developer. Other nights we wondered whether we'd made the biggest mistake of our lives. Money disappeared quickly. Clients didn't. For almost 6 months, nobody hired us. I emptied nearly all of my savings just keeping the lights on. One Friday afternoon, Noah looked at me and quietly asked, "If this doesn't work, what's our backup plan?" I stared at the whiteboard covered with unfinished ideas. "We make this work." He smiled. "That's not a backup plan." "No, it's the only plan." The first client finally arrived during our 7th month. A local delivery company needed software to organize daily routes. The project wasn't glamorous. It barely paid enough to cover rent, but they loved the product. Then they recommended us to another company. That company introduced us to another. Slowly, without anyone noticing, momentum began replacing luck. Every small success felt enormous. The first employee, the first office with real windows, the first 6-figure contract, the first industry award. I wanted to tell my family every time something exciting happened. I really did. But each attempt ended the same way. One Thanksgiving I mentioned we'd hired 10 employees. Mom smiled politely before turning to Ethan. "So, tell everyone about your annual bonus." Another Christmas, I shared that we'd opened a second office. Dad nodded once before asking Ethan about a management training program. Even birthdays became predictable. Someone would eventually ask, "So, Olivia, are you still doing computer stuff?" I'd answer yes. The conversation would end there. After a while, I stopped volunteering information. Not because I was embarrassed, because constantly explaining your dream to people who already dismissed it becomes exhausting. Meanwhile, our company kept growing. National retailers became clients, then international companies. Investors started calling us instead of the other way around. For the first time, people in my industry knew my name. Ironically, the people who had watched me work hardest knew the least about what I actually did. A year ago, one of the world's largest technology companies contacted us. They weren't interested in becoming customers. They wanted to buy the entire company. The negotiations lasted 11 months. Hundreds of pages of contracts. Late-night conference calls. Lawyers. Auditors. Financial reviews. There were moments I thought the deal would collapse. Instead, an hour before Sunday dinner, every final document had been signed. Now, sitting quietly beside my brother as everyone celebrated his promotion, I looked down at my phone one more time. The message from Daniel was still there. Acquisition complete. Funds successfully transferred. $80 million. I slipped the phone back into my pocket without saying a word. Across the table, Ethan stood to make another thank you speech. He smiled proudly as everyone lifted their glasses again. Completely unaware that his little sister had quietly become financially independent for life just minutes before dessert. Ethan stood, straightened his tie, and lifted his wine glass. "I just want to thank everyone for believing in me." The room erupted into applause again. Dad smiled so widely I thought his face might hurt. Mom reached over and squeezed Ethan's arm. "I always knew you were destined for leadership." My grandmother nodded proudly. "We've been watching this young man work toward success since he was a boy." I clapped with everyone else. Not because anyone expected me to, because Ethan genuinely had worked hard. Success isn't smaller simply because someone else has more of it. That wasn't the problem. The problem was what happened next. Mom looked across the table. "You know," she said loudly, "it's nice seeing one of my children build a real career." Several relatives laughed. I smiled politely. Dad added, "Not everyone enjoys the stability of a regular paycheck." Another laugh circled the table. No one realized those words were aimed directly at me. I took a slow sip of water instead of responding. My Aunt Linda turned toward me with a sympathetic smile. "So, Olivia, how's your little computer project going?" The table grew quiet. Everyone waited for my answer. "It's going well," I said. She smiled kindly. "That's nice." Then she immediately turned back toward Ethan. "So, tell us about your new office." That was it. 8 years of work summarized in one sentence. "That's nice." The conversation moved on without me. Ethan described his new responsibilities: regional meetings, department budgets, leadership seminars. Everyone listened carefully. Every detail mattered. Meanwhile, my phone vibrated inside my purse. Once, twice, 3 times. I didn't have to look. I already knew it was Daniel. The acquisition couldn't officially close until every final banking confirmation had been verified. "Excuse me," I said quietly. "I need to take a quick call." Mom frowned. "Can it wait? It's work." She waved her hand dismissively. "I suppose." I stepped through the sliding glass door onto my parents' back patio. The cool evening air felt strangely peaceful after the noise inside. Before I could unlock my phone, it rang again. Daniel's name filled the screen. I answered immediately. "Hi, Daniel." His voice sounded unusually cheerful. "Congratulations, Olivia. It's official." I leaned against the patio railing. Everything cleared? Every wire transfer. Every regulatory approval. Every signature. The acquisition is completely finalized. I closed my eyes. After 11 exhausting months, it was over. "Congratulations," he repeated. "You officially own the proceeds. Your financial advisor will contact you tomorrow morning." I laughed softly, not because of the money, because the pressure I'd carried for nearly a year had finally disappeared. "Thank you," I said. "I couldn't have done this without the team. You built an incredible company. You earned this." We spoke for another minute about paperwork, tax planning, and a few remaining administrative details. Before hanging up, Daniel added one last sentence. "Oh, the acquiring company's CEO asked me to tell you personally that they're honored to continue your vision." For a moment, I simply stared into the dark backyard. 8 years. Hundreds of 14-hour days. Thousands of decisions. Dozens of setbacks. Every sacrifice had led here. I slipped my phone back into my purse and returned inside. Nobody looked up. Mom was still talking. Dad was carving dessert. Ethan was laughing with our cousins. Rachel glanced at me. "Everything okay?" I smiled. "Everything's great." She nodded without another question. No one asked who had called. No one wondered why I'd been outside smiling. As far as my family knew, nothing important had happened. I picked up my fork as chocolate cake was placed in front of everyone. Then the front doorbell rang. Dad looked toward the hallway. "That's strange. We aren't expecting anyone." I looked toward the front entrance. I knew exactly who it was. And somehow, I had a feeling this dinner was finally about to become unforgettable. Dad pushed his chair back and walked toward the front door. "I'll get it." The dining room continued buzzing with conversation. Mom was telling my aunt how Ethan would probably become a vice president within a few years. Ethan laughed. "I've still got a long way to go." The front door opened. A few seconds later, Dad called into the dining room. "Olivia, someone's here for you." Every conversation stopped. I stood and walked into the foyer. Standing beside my father was Daniel Brooks, the same attorney who had represented my company throughout the acquisition. He smiled apologetically. "I'm so sorry to interrupt your family dinner." "No problem," I said. "I thought everything was finished." "It is." He held up a slim leather folder. "One final original signature is required for the physical closing documents." I could have waited until tomorrow, but the acquiring company's legal department is releasing the final escrow tonight. I didn't want to delay your funding. I nodded. Let's take care of it. Mom and everyone else had followed us into the hallway. She smiled politely. So you're Olivia's lawyer? Daniel nodded. I am. Mom laughed. Well, whatever little project she's working on must be getting serious. I smiled but said nothing. Daniel opened the folder across the entryway table. Several documents were neatly arranged. He pointed to one signature line after another. I signed calmly, initialed each page, dated the final agreement. While I worked, Ethan leaned closer. So, what kind of business are you in? Daniel answered before I could. Olivia founded an enterprise software company. Ethan nodded politely. That's impressive. Mom smiled. I always hoped she'd eventually find something stable. Daniel looked slightly confused. I'm fairly certain she already has. Everyone chuckled politely. Then Dad noticed one document. His eyes narrowed. Daniel? Is that number? He adjusted his glasses. 80 million? Mom laughed immediately. Oh, Harold. You're reading it wrong. She looked toward Daniel. I'm guessing that's 80,000. That would certainly be exciting. Daniel blinked once, then answered as naturally as if discussing the weather. No. The acquisition value was $80 million. Silence. Absolute silence. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway suddenly seemed louder. Mom stared at Daniel. I'm sorry. Did you say 80 million? Yes. The transaction officially closed this evening. Dad slowly looked toward me. You sold your company? I nodded. This afternoon. Ethan frowned. The company you've been building all these years? Yes. The little computer project? I couldn't help smiling. It grew a little. Daniel closed the folder. Actually, it became one of the fastest-growing logistics software platforms in North America. We've had acquisition offers for over 2 years. This one simply happened to be the right fit. My aunt covered her mouth. I had no idea. I know, I answered gently. Nobody did. Mom lowered herself into the nearest chair. But why didn't you tell us? I thought about that question for a moment, then answered honestly. I tried. When I hired employees. When we opened another office. When we signed national clients. When we won industry awards. Every conversation lasted about 30 seconds before everyone changed the subject. Nobody argued, because nobody could. Daniel handed me one final page. Congratulations again. It has genuinely been an honor representing you. I signed the last document. He shook my hand warmly. I'll let you get back to your evening. After he left, nobody spoke. The dining room that had echoed with applause only minutes earlier now felt impossibly quiet. I picked up my coat from the hallway chair. Mom finally found her voice. Olivia, I'm so proud of you. I smiled kindly. I appreciate that. Then I looked around the room. I never wanted tonight to become a competition. I opened the front door. I just wanted someone to ask about my dream before it became impossible to ignore. Nobody tried to stop me as I walked toward my car. The evening air was cool, and for the first time in years, I felt no pressure to explain myself. I wasn't angry. I wasn't celebrating. Mostly, I felt relieved. My phone buzzed before I even started the engine. Mom. I let it ring. Then Dad called. I answered. Hi, Dad. His voice was quiet. Are you driving? Not yet. Good. He took a slow breath. I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything you don't mean. I mean it. Another pause. I spent years asking Ethan about promotions, bonuses, and job titles. I never once asked you what you were building. I looked through the windshield at the dark street. I noticed. I know. I thought I understood success. I guess I only understood what looked familiar. His honesty caught me off guard. I'm sorry, he whispered. I should have been proud long before tonight. That would have meant more than what happened at dinner. I know. Before hanging up, he quietly said, I hope you'll give us another chance someday. I'll think about it. 2 days later, Mom asked if we could meet for coffee. I almost declined. Instead, I went. She looked nervous before I even sat down. I've replayed Sunday night 100 times, she admitted. I realized something. I waited. I knew every detail about Ethan's career. She looked down at her coffee. I didn't even know the name of your company. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then she smiled sadly. You deserved better from me. Those words didn't erase 8 years. But they mattered. Because this time, they weren't followed by excuses. Weeks passed. Life slowly returned to normal. The acquiring company invited me to remain as an executive advisor for a year. I accepted. Not because I needed the money, because I believed in the people who had built the company beside me. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened inside my family. Dad started asking questions. Real questions. What are you working on? How was your meeting? What excites you about this project? Simple conversations. The kind I'd secretly wanted since I was 25. Even Ethan changed. One evening he called. I owe you an apology. You don't have to. I do. I spent years assuming your work wasn't serious. I never bothered learning what you actually did. I smiled. It happens. No, it shouldn't. After that, our conversations became surprisingly easy. For the first time in our lives, we spoke as equals instead of competitors. Several months later, Sunday dinners quietly returned. This time they felt different. People listened instead of assuming. Questions replaced comparisons. Celebrations became shared instead of divided. One evening, Mom stood to make another toast. Everyone instinctively looked toward Ethan. She smiled, then raised her glass toward both of us. To my children. Not because of salaries. Not because of promotions. But because they never stopped working for what they believed in. Nobody applauded louder than Ethan. Neither did I. We simply smiled. Driving home that night, I realized something I wished I'd understood years earlier. Success doesn't become more valuable because other people notice it. Its value was already there while nobody was watching. For years, I thought I needed one extraordinary moment to prove I belonged. I was wrong. The $80 million deal didn't change who I was. It simply revealed who had been paying attention and who hadn't. The biggest victory I earned wasn't the company I built. It was finally understanding that real confidence never interrupts someone else's celebration just to demand recognition. Because the people who truly value you won't need a headline to see your worth.